Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Humanities Cafe. My name is Stacy Chadausha. I am the program coordinator here at South Dakota Humanities Council, and I am delighted that you could join us today. We're going to talk about something that's pretty apropos right now. First, before we start, I need to ask everybody to please mute your microphone so we don't get feedback and interruption, and I appreciate that. Thanks so much. So we're going to start off by just, going right into it. Political polarization. It's at an all-time high in this country. Chances are good that you or someone you know is in a situation where you've either avoided talking to someone like family or friends because of political differences, or that the thought of those people and or your difference of opinion makes you grit your teeth. Our personal relationships, as well as our well-being, are suffering because of this polarization. But today's guest has some solutions for making connections across the political divide and learning to navigate the myriad of challenges brought about by living in a divided nation. This is not a partisan discussion in any way, but a discussion aimed to be useful in a multitude of ways. So joining us today is Dr. Tania Israel, whose latest book, Facing the Fracture: How to Navigate the Challenges of Living in a Divided Nation, can help us find and nurture the resilience we all need in our current socio-political climate. Dr. Israel, we are delighted to have you join us. Please tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Tania Israel, and how do you become interested in this area of expertise?
Oh, well, first of all, Stacy, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation and to be part of the South Dakota Festival of Books next week. And thank you all for joining us as well. I am a professor emeritus of counseling psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I'm going to have to go back a minute or two to talk about how I got involved in this to the mid 1990s when I started a group to bring together pro choice and pro life people to have dialogue with each other, which was an absolutely transformational experience for me. It didn't change anything about how I felt about abortion, but it changed so much about how I felt about people who disagreed with me on it. It helped me to understand other people, it humanized them for me. And I really brought that experience forward with me for the rest of my career and the rest of my life, where most of my research has been on LGBTQ psychology, which has brought me into contact with people who haven't necessarily seen eye to eye with me, but I've always come about it with a real interest and curiosity and an approach that's more about building bridges. So now we're going to get more recent. Right after the 2016 election, it was clear to me, and I think everybody else, that we were having trouble in this country with political division and having trouble communicating across these divides. At that point, I had been teaching listening skills for decades, and I had had this earlier experience. And I thought, well, maybe I can do something to help. So I started creating resources. The first resource I created is something I call the flow chart that will resolve all political conflict in our country, because I am optimistic like that. Spoiler alert, it has not actually resolved all political conflict in our country, but I tend to think it's just a distribution issue. So you can download it for free from my website and just get it to everybody out there, and we're going to be fine then. But in case we need a little bit more, I did start then doing workshops to help people develop skills that would help them in conversations. And then when that was still didn't quite provide what everybody needed, I wrote a book called Beyond Your Bubble: How to Connect Across the Political Divide. And that was really what has set me off on this journey that I've been doing for many years now. And so I'll pause there.
Okay, and I do want to tell you, I should have told everybody at the outset here, this is an interactive conversation. So if you have questions for Dr. Israel, or you want to, toss in what's happened to, your own personal experiences and stuff in this regard, by all means, either just raise your hand, put it in the chat, and we'll get you involved. So you alluded to your first book and your second book. So your first book, Beyond Your Bubble: How to Connect Across the Political Divide. And then your second book now, Facing the Fracture: How to Navigate the Challenges of Living in a Divided Nation, excuse me. Both of these books are invaluable. You can see I've bookmarked and highlighted, underlined, you name it. But your latest book, Facing the Fracture, is particularly timely for the current socio-political climate we're in right now and the cultural and political upheaval we're currently facing in this country. So what is the underlying premise of this book, and how did it come to be?
Well, after I wrote Beyond Your Bubble, some people said, this is exactly the resource I need. I'm having trouble communicating with somebody, and I just needed some skills and examples for how to do that. Fantastic. But then there were those people who said, well, it's all very well and good that you wrote this book about dialogue, but I don't want to talk to those people. But I'm still kind of losing it. So what do you got for me? And that really made me think about what is it more comprehensively that people need right now? Because the challenges that we're navigating, they're not all about how to have conversations. You can be sitting by yourself in your home freaking out about people on the other side. You can be listening to the radio. You can be, you know, scrolling through your social media. There's so many things that we're reacting to and responding to. You can see somebody's lawn sign or bumper sticker or hat. And so this is really something to help people to develop some resilience in these times and to be able to maybe not only be able to navigate these things on a basic level, but to really be able to even take opportunities that exist because of this division to lean into things like community engagement and to develop some skills that are going to help us in other areas of our lives as well.
Perfect. So there's a lot to unpack. Like I said, I have read this book, and we're going to just dive right in. So the book is broken down into three parts. Why did you write it that way? And are there distinguishing characteristics between them? What's the distinction?
Sure. Well, so like I said, not everything's about dialogue. I will say there's a chapter in this book in Facing the Fracture about dialogue. It's chapter 8
Mm.
because what I realized is there was so much that people were saying was interfering with even being able to get to that point. So the first section is really about how do we turn down the volume on the polarizing input that we're receiving, because so many of the reasons that people are struggling have to do with how we view people on the other side, how we understand polarization to be happening, and we can get a little bit more into that. But also things like how are we consuming our news? How are we interacting with social media? And what are the cognitive biases that we have that are skewing our understanding of people? So the first section is really about how do we understand other people and in some ways ourselves more clearly and accurately within this context, and that can help us to sort of settle the all the static a little bit, so that then we're starting with a calmer baseline. From there it's like, okay, well, once we've calmed our nervous system a little bit, what do we need to do? What do we need to build to be ready to face the challenges that we have? And so that's where I get into resilience, and as well as things like intellectual humility. How do we open our minds? How do we even want to open our minds to other people? And compassion. How do we open our hearts? And nobody wants to start with compassion. They say, well, I don't have enough compassion for those extremists over there. So that's why we've got to correct some stuff, build some resilience before we can get there. And then part 3 is all about engagement. So I tell people you can get through 2/3 of this book without interacting with another person. And some people are really relieved to hear that. Because they're like, okay, that's great. I don't necessarily want to. If after going through all of that, you have, I don't know, a little bit of a desire to engage, then how do you do that effectively? So, how do we have effective dialogue? But also, how do we engage in our communities, and in our country in such a way that we can be effective? And then I also talk about the bridging movement, which we can talk about more, which are the folks who are really working on bringing our country back together.
Okay, so let's tackle these sections one at a time. So in part one, on page 17, you say conflict is central to stories. Don't get caught up in the narrative of conflict. Adjust your perspective to have a more accurate understanding of the political landscape. So you state that rewriting the conflict narrative means not only changing our views, but our behaviors as well. What does this mean, and how does your analogy of Rocky Balboa come into play?
Right. I only saw the movie Rocky in the past few years, which is sort of remarkable in itself. It's a really good film. But one of the things that I was really struck by was Rocky's training journey, Rocky starts out and sort of has this, not great diet, like of what he's eating, and he's not really training very seriously. And I realize, if we're not being intentional about our media diet and about our behaviors of what we're doing to interact with social media and things, then that can put us in a place where we're not really ready for the challenge. But then, you get this great training montage with a good soundtrack where Rocky's really like working towards some goals. And I thought, all right, we can be like Rocky. We might be starting out not very intentional about how we're taking in the news and social media, but we can change those behaviors in such a way that we're going to be in a healthier place, and we're going to be more ready to meet some challenges.
Okay.
And that piece
So,
about the
oh, go
conflict
ahead.
narrative, I'll
Mhm.
just say, we are drawn to conflict narratives.
Yeah.
You're probably not going to see a TV show or a movie that's just like, here are a bunch of nice people who all get along with each other. There's some conflict that drives the story. That's sort of natural in what we're looking for. The problem is that we're in this situation right now where we're really seeing ourselves in this story as in this conflict with these, we are the good people and the people on the other side are the evil, vicious ones. And the way to be heroic is to hate them. And so I really want to give us some other alternatives to be able to think about ourselves and other people in such a way that it's not as divisive.
Thank you. So, central to this whole thing is polarization, right? So, are there different types of polarization, and is one more prominent in our current political landscape than the other?
Such a great question, because usually when we think about polarization, we're thinking about the distance between our views and the views of people on the other side. And what I hear from people, because we can say we're the most polarized that we've been in recent history. And
Mhm.
people think that means that like our views used to be closer and our views have gotten really extreme and far apart. Turns out our views have gotten a little bit farther apart and a little bit more consolidated on either side, but there's way more overlap in our views than we think there is. We're not nearly as far apart in our opinions about things as we think we are. The type of polarization that has ramped up dramatically in the last few years is something that we call affective polarization. Affective polarization is the distancing and the mistrust that we feel toward people who are on the other side of the political spectrum. So it's not about their views being so different. It's really about the animosity that we're feeling. And we're at the point where people say in surveys that they don't want to live near, work with, or have a family member marry somebody who's in a different political party. And the more affiliated with our political party we are, the more mistrust we're feeling toward people on the other side. And we're largely overestimating their animosity toward us, their support for violence, their desire to circumvent democracy. And so we have these particular views of them that also are driving these feelings that we're having. So it's really that affective polarization that's more corrosive than an ideological or a opinion difference kind of polarization.
So, what something else you mentioned is tribalism. What do you mean by tribalism, and how does it factor into that effective polarization? And has this changed over time?
Yeah, so now we're going to go back like even farther than the mid 1990s. Um, as humans evolved, so we're going way back in time, we lived in small groups of people or tribes. And it was really important that we did that. We could not survive on our own. And so we were protecting ourselves and each other from a harsh environment, but also we were aware that there are these other tribes who,
Mhm.
were a threat, and we're protecting ourselves from these other tribes. So it became very important for us to not be tossed out of our tribe. So you have to sort of stay with your tribe, and in some ways in opposition to these other tribes. Our brains developed in these contexts where this is how we see ourselves within our group and how we see the people in another group. And we're overlaying these tribal brains onto our current politics, and this is why when we are interacting with somebody who has a different view, or like I said, even a lawn sign can trigger us such that we feel unsafe, we feel threatened by that because we're seeing them as being this other tribe, and that feels like an existential threat to us, like our survival depends on it.
So you already touched on this a little bit. In your book, in chapter 1, you talk about common misconceptions. And one of them in particular is worth pointing out: the extent to which people are at the extreme, where, Republicans and Democrats perceive each other as holding more extreme views than they actually do. And that 2/3 of Americans are actually in between those extremes. Can you tell us a little more about that and fill us in on who is the exhausted majority?
Oh, yes. Oh my gosh, the exhausted majority really needs some attention because what we all imagine is that the other side is more extreme than they really are. We even think our own side is more extreme than we really are. And some of this is because this is what we're exposed to all the time in the media. The journalists don't interview people who say, "Oh yeah, I can really see it either way." That they're bringing in the people who have more forceful and disparate views from each other. So this is a way, and social media is the same way. The people who post about politics on social media are more extreme and are actually more hostile, just in terms of their personalities, than people who don't post about politics on social media. So everything that we're seeing and hearing is from these extremes, and we think, oh, that's all that exists. But what the research shows is that, sure, there are people at either extreme. There's no question about that. Then you also have people who are sort of the more traditional partisans, more traditional Democrats and Republicans. But most people are in the middle, what they call the exhausted majority. And what they're exhausted by the vitriol, by the animosity that they're hearing from people on either side. And the people who are in the exhausted majority, they're less likely to vote. They don't watch as much news as the people on either extreme. They prioritize other things in life over politics sometimes. And when they do vote, they don't necessarily vote a party line. They consider different issues independent of others. So they're different from people who are more affiliated with either side and either party. The other interesting thing about the exhausted majority, whereas people on either extreme have really skewed perceptions of people on the other side, like I was saying, the people in the middle, the exhausted majority, actually have more accurate perceptions of people on either side than people on either side have of each other. And so it turns out that the less news you watch in some ways, the more accurate your understanding is of people on either side because you're not being fed like a particular and more extreme narrative of those other folks.
I thought it was interesting, and I just put it up there so people can see what I'm talking about with this graph, this illustration here. But you said that the people at the extremes have something in common with each other that distinguishes them from others: their engagement with politics. So the ones that are on the extreme then are actually more similar to each other than the exhausted majority. I thought it was very interesting. And then you led into the perception gap. What is that, and
Mhm.
how are we all affected by that?
Yeah. So to take your first point, which is, people on the left and the right, they do have things in common with each other. They don't like it when I say this, but these are, the people who are the news junkies. You can't have
Mhm.
a conversation with them without them mentioning an elected official, a policy, something related to politics. And they also tend to be more emotionally engaged in those political issues than people in the middle. So legitimately, there are some differences between people on the left and the right, but the people who are more at the extremes, they've got something in common with each other that's different from the people in the middle, in the exhausted majority. And it's important to know because we have a divide in this country, not just between left and right. We have a divide between people who are really into politics and people who don't want to talk about politics. And it's helpful to know that because if you are someone who's really into politics and you're like, how do I appeal to people who are not so engaged, who are more in the middle, who are more moderate? You don't necessarily go heavy at them with politics, is the first thing I would say. That they sort of feel like, that the people on either side, it's just like we won't shut up about politics, and they're not as interested in it. So to your second point, the perception gap. I was saying, people on either side really misconstrue the views of people on the other side in terms of the extreme, thinking that the other side's more extreme. That's a perception gap. It's, let's say you I use pie and cake as an example. Like, let's say you like pie better than cake. And I'm like, oh, you love pie and you hate cake. Like, I'm going to see it, much more extreme than it is. So the distance between what your views really are and the way I see your views, that's the perception gap. That's where I'm perceiving you differently than where you are. And if we look at research across many decades, across different kinds of methods, across different kinds of samples, we see the perception gap happening between people, in either party very consistently across time and space.
Dell has a comment in the chat, which
Mm.
actually that was good. It's perfect for my next question. He asked, "Is this the result of cable television with channels that only present extremist views?" Because my question was, how does current news media contribute further to the divisiveness in this country with the 24-hour volume of news, polarizing biases, problems versus solutions, all of that?
Mm. Such a great question. So I'm old enough that I grew up without cable.
Mm.
It didn't exist when I was young, and so my parents read the paper. They read a national paper in the morning, they read the local paper in the afternoon, and they watched half an hour of news. And that, they listened to the radio sometimes in the morning. But that was like, okay, you would get the news at certain times of day, and the rest of the time there wasn't new news available. And then there was cable news, and it seemed like, oh, this is so great because now we're going to be better informed. We'll be, more informed citizens, and that's going to be a really good thing for our country. And it turns out, though, if you have to supply people news 24 hours a day, then a couple things happen. One is there's not always new things happening all the time. So you need to maybe fill in some of the gaps with commentary. So, more people who are giving an analysis of the news. But the analysis of the news is, again, there's a story to it, so the journalists will tell you, they don't give news in bullet points. They've got a story, there's a perspective. And especially if it's commentary, that's going to have a perspective not only about what's happening, but about the people who stand on different sides of that issue. And so that's one of the things. There's a lot more commentary about the supporters and opposition to any particular issue. The other thing that happens with 24-hour news is that you've got to make it exciting or
Yep.
people will not keep watching it. There's got to be something that grabs you. Well, it turns out as humans and as viewers, what grabs us is conflict. And so, I mean, I can say that, well, the media, the news, they're feeding us all of this conflict narrative and all of this news that's really commentary about how extreme and wrong the other side is. But I'm going to also say, we gobble that up because we want to, first of all, we like stories of conflict. Second of all, in this conflict, we are the heroes. The news that we tune into is the stuff that tells us we are right and the other side is wrong. And we're all tuning into that. It's something called confirmation bias, where we focus on things that confirm what we already believe to be true. And ignore or dismiss information that conflicts with our existing beliefs. So we're making some choices here. And it's just getting us more and more dug into our own perspective, not just about the issues, but about ourselves and other people.
And then you take what you're saying about news, regular news media, and then we're going to toss in there social media. So, what is social media actually designed to do, and how does it go about it? I think that's an important thing to consider when we think about what social media is actually for.
Social media is designed to keep us engaged.
Mhm.
If we are not paying attention to social media, it's a tree falling in the forest and no one's hearing it. So, in order for social media to thrive, it needs for people to pay attention. And again, what people pay attention to is more about conflict. So, if you post about an issue and an opinion about an issue, get some traction. Um, if you post an opinion about people on the other side of the issue, that's when you're going to go viral. That's what people really love. They really love the stories that are about what idiots the people on the other side are, or how extreme they are, and how misinformed they are, and how violent they are. That really catches on. But I mean, I know this because I post all these things about how we're not really as far apart as we think we are. And they don't support violence as much as we imagine they do. And, so I post all this stuff. I do have followers, but I'm just going to say it doesn't get as much traction as the stories about how we're at war. That's something that people can really grab onto. And I'm not saying that, it's because it's not true, that we shouldn't, focus on it as much. The things that people post are often factually true, but they're a small slice that tells a particular story. There are other slices that tell other stories, but the algorithms, even more than the confirmation bias with the news, in social media, it really draws us into these very separate echo chambers where we're just hearing the same things over and over again. And that makes us feel like that is true, that is the only way to see it, and we can't possibly imagine how people could see things another way.
So, how does social media then impact political polarization?
So it again reinforces these ideas we have about how extreme other people are. The people who are posting are more extreme. The views about other people are the things that are going to get the most traction. And sometimes we think, oh, people will say to me, well, I tried to have a conversation with my cousin about this issue, but things didn't go well. And I said, oh, well, tell me about the conversation. They'll say, well, yeah, they posted this thing on Facebook and then I made a comment and then things really went south from there. And I'm like, okay, let's define
Yeah.
conversation. If you are interacting with someone on social media, it's not a conversation, it's not a dialogue, and it's not a good place to try to resolve disagreement or even help somebody understand a different perspective. In fact, there was this really interesting study where they said, okay, we're going to send conservative tweets to liberal people and liberal tweets to conservative people, and let's see if that convinces them to view things differently. And basically, what happened is instead of drawing them closer together, it pushed them farther apart. So, if we think that by disagreeing with somebody on social media, we're going to bring them around to our perspective, it's the facts say that that's not actually what's going to happen.
I think I read it, I'm not sure which book it was, but you said conversation is face to face, not Facebook to Facebook. And I think that that's a key to actual conversation. So you point out that social media has some beneficial uses for combating political polarization. What does that mean?
So social media in itself is not something that's evil.
Mhm.
We have to think about how we use it. And there are some, rabbit holes we can fall down that aren't good. Don't doom scroll before bed. But one of the things that I do that I find really helpful is sometimes because, I've got my own people around me and I can get surrounded by this kind of echo chamber of the way to view something. I sometimes use social media to get myself out of that. Like I'll be like, okay, here's an issue that I am having trouble seeing more than one side of things. So I'll sometimes like look at a hashtag and I'll be like, what's the range of things that people are saying about this? And I will say, oh, I see what other people are saying about this. I can see why people would see that differently. And here's the worst thing, they are calling out my side on our hypocrisy. And I'm like, oh, yeah, actually, they're not wrong about that. It's really the worst thing about this work that I'm doing. I could always see the hypocrisy of people on the other side. Now I see the hypocrisy of people on my own side, and it just makes me no fun for people to vent to. But that's one of the things that I learn about. Like, if you're open to it, if you're like, okay, I really truly want to understand how people are seeing things, social media can show you something about that.
So kind of it's one of the things that I found most interesting is your discussion about misinformation. And when you wrote the book, you pointed out that we aren't exposed to as much misinformation as we think we are. But
Yeah.
is that still the case? I mean, things have changed a little bit now, and since even in the short time since you wrote the book, where um, there's alternative facts that we know to be alternative facts, and they're coming through what we would otherwise think was a legitimate, avenue. So is this information exposure still not as low as we think it is, or has it increased?
So misinformation and disinformation do exist, and they are
Mhm.
problematic where they exist. And they can do damage, they can affect people's behaviors and things like that. And What I what the research shows is that there's a lot of things that aren't misinformation per se. They're not wrong. They might be taking like a piece of information and saying it over and over and over and over and over again so that it seems like more true than other information that conflicts with it. Um, that also has some truth in it. This is where I say it's not necessarily that people are, that a news source that I disagree with is providing like things that aren't facts, that aren't factually true. But that their angle on it, their story about it is very different from the story that I have. And what they call it, like if somebody says, oh, this election was stolen, or somebody says, oh, people aren't getting vaccinated, or people say, like there's a lot of different kinds of controversial issues that we can spin in a certain way. Um, but when you say, okay, well, let's look how much of this is opinion, and how much of this is factual. And when you get down to the facts that people have, what they're saying is, oh, well, there's this incident that happened at this polling location, or they're saying, yes, but this percentage of people, didn't get vaccines at this point. Like there's some factual information there, but it's not the whole story. And that's where it's not as much about misinformation being the problem, but about small slices of information that we're exposed to that we get really deeply embedded in, and that we're not seeing what other people are seeing. And so we're like, well, they think this ridiculous thing. How could they possibly get there? So, yes, misinformation is a problem where it exists, and it doesn't exist as much as we think. And the fact that we think misinformation is such a problem, because I'm going to tell you both sides think that the other side is misinformed. It really plays into our cognitive bias about how we're right and they're wrong. And so it's something that we're drawn to, is this narrative of misinformation.
So how can we address misinformation then, or what perceived misinformation on social media? You mentioned the SIFT method. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Mhm. So one of the things that we can do is when we see something on social media, you know, we can we can think about it critically. But one of the things that research shows is that if we even pause for a moment and think, hmm, does that seem accurate? Then we have a better chance of determining whether or not it's accurate than if we just sort of glance it and don't give it any more thought. Then it has an easier chance of kind of embedding in our minds. But if we just sort of stop, we think about it for a moment. So stopping is a good thing to do. And then, we want to try to, figure out where does this come from and how accurate might this be. So we want to look at sources. So we want to say, all right, what's the source of this information? And does this seem to be a reliable source? And then also, are there ways that this is being um, that there's an angle that they're taking on this that's trying to make a particular point from this information that's not necessarily the only conclusion that you can come to from it. So you want to be able to pause, look at the source, and then try to understand what sorts of narratives is this playing into, and is make some decisions for yourself then about, do you want to take that in wholeheartedly? One of the things that I'll do sometimes is if I see some content that's really emotionally activating, that'll grab me too. And I'll be like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. And I'll be like, okay, let me now go and find more information about that topic that's from a different source that doesn't seem intent on getting me emotionally activated about it. And that'll help me to do some deeper, broader research without necessarily getting like hooked by that emotion.
Okay, so and it brought to mind back in July, I think it was the end of July, we had a Humanities Cafe episode on uh, media and informational literacy, and so that was something that we had talked about then too. Tracing the source, make sure that it's a legitimate source. But how can we turn in it a little bit now? How can we be more intentional when using social media to combat the echo chamber effect?
hmm So the first thing that we should do, I'm just going to tell everyone, turn off your notifications. There's like, unless you're in some very specific lines of work, you don't need to know this minute that something has happened. So you can actually control a little bit more when you are taking in information from social media. So then figure out, like, what is it that you're trying to get out of social media, being intentional about it. I mean, it could be anything from, I want to know what's going on with this bill in Congress, or I want to know what's going on in world affairs, or I want to know, what Taylor Swift wore last night. Any of those are things that you might want to find out, know what it is that you're looking for, and then decide how, like, where am I going to find out this information and how long do I want to spend doing it? And maybe even set a timer for yourself. That is going to keep you informed, get you what you want, but then get you back out of it. What happens so often for people now is that they'll go and they'll look, and then 45 minutes later they'll look up from their phone and they don't even know where they've been. And like, we get to control our phones. We don't want them controlling us. So there are some things that we can do in terms of how we're interacting with them that help. The other thing I've started doing is not having my phone on me all the time. Yeah, I've created a little charging station by my front door. I'll plug in my phone when I come home, and I don't have it on me all the time. And yes, it's not counting my steps when I'm doing laundry, but it turns out I'm doing those steps anyway. I don't need for it to count them for me.
So just briefly, there you mentioned distorted perception of confirmation bias, but can you tell us a little bit more about really briefly what naive realism and motive attribution asymmetry, how they come into? I know that's a big word, and I had to like really think about it, but it's important to understand what does that mean?
These are the big three cognitive biases that are really contributing to polarization. So we talked about confirmation bias before. Naive realism is the one where we think that we are objective and they are biased, and we all believe that. Motive attribution asymmetry is the one where we think that we are motivated by love and benevolence, and they are motivated by hatred corruption, and violence. And so a lot of this early work was actually done in the Middle East, where they talked to Israeli Jews and Palestinians, and both sides said, yes, my side is motivated by love, and they want to kill us. And this is something that we see playing out also in our politics in the US these days.
A question in the chat from Dell says, do you have any solutions to the divisions beyond the recommendation that you have for personal adjustments? And I think that dives into part 2 of your book.
Great. Sure. So, and I don't know if beyond personal adjustments means more at a systemic level. I'm just going to say I think most of my stuff is for all of us.
Mhm.
Uh, it's not about what politicians should do. It's not about what owners of media agencies should do, because most of us are not elected officials. Most of us are not owners of media conglomerates, but we're everyday people trying to get through our lives. And so most of what I have to say is for all of us. It's certainly also helpful for people who are in those kinds of positions. I'm going to recommend Ezra Klein's book, Why We're Polarized, does a much better job than I do of looking at systemic change and what we should do. I also noticed that that somebody's got their hand up. I don't know if you see that, Stacy.
I do not.
Oh, that's me.
Oh,
I was just,
Sarah, sorry about that.
that's okay. As you might see by my title there, I work at a public library, and so this is a a really hot topic for me here, as libraries are to remain neutral when it comes to anything in regards to political matters. And so I just was curious. I've not read your books, but I'm curious to them as to far as tips and tricks for those that, even if I personally have what you say as a side, that try to not have, my patrons that come into the library that really want to get me worked up, like they come in, I think, seeking that. Is there any tips and tricks in there for trying to remain neutral in a political conversation? I mean, I want to hear somebody out if they need to come in, talk about it, vent or anything, but if there are any tricks for that, to be an active listener yet remain, neutral in a conversation. So
Oh, that's a great question. And I also want to say thank you so much for being in a public library. I feel like libraries are such an important part of the fabric of our communities. That group that I started to bring together pro-choice and pro-life people back in the 90s, we met at our local public library, and it was really seen more as neutral territory then. But I would say that everything gets polarized these days, and I think libraries are, certainly caught up in that right now. And so I want to say thank you, and I want to say I see you, like I see what's happening. And I went to the American Library Association conference in June and just talked to so many people who were like, "We are just trying to hold the line here to keep the public informed, to keep materials available to the public." So what happens then when you get confronted? So I'll say we've talked a lot about sort of part 1 of the Facing the Fracture book, which is about like how to turn down the volume on polarizing input. The next piece is like, okay, well, what do we have to develop within ourselves as well? One of the things is when somebody comes at you with conflict, what happens is it pushes our buttons, right? That you start to feel like flushed, and your breathing gets shallow and your muscles get tense. And basically, we're in fight or flight mode. We are reacting in the same way that we would react if we're confronted with a saber-toothed tiger, because that's how our bodies were built, that when we are confronted with threat, that's how we respond. And that's really good if there's a saber-toothed tiger or a bear in front of you, because you want to either be able to fight the bear or run away from the bear. But what do we want to do with other people? Well, hopefully, if we've turned down some of that polarizing volume and kept our cognitive biases in check, we recognize that's not a bear, that's not a saber-toothed tiger. I might be feeling triggered, but I a this is not a life or death kind of threat like my body's reacting to it as. If it is a physically dangerous situation, obviously get out of there. But if it's not a dangerous situation, but you're feeling unsafe, and this is what I hear from people all the time. People say, I feel unsafe when I'm talking with people who have this or that view. And I say, oh, well, if you're in danger, you should, get out of that situation. They're like, no, 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 I'm not in danger. I just feel unsafe. I'm not unsafe, but I feel unsafe. Oh, how many of us are feeling that these days, right? If you're not unsafe, but you're feeling unsafe, the best thing that we can do is to learn how to manage our physiological reaction, because that will put us in a better state to be able to deal with another person in front of us rather than a bear. And so the ways that we can do that, one of the simplest ways is by breathing, which, okay, granted, we're all doing that all the time, but we're not necessarily doing it in such a way that's going to calm us. So we want to take slow, deep breaths. You can do that without the other person even knowing you're doing anything. They're confronting you. There's all this stuff going on, and just think, okay, I'm going to breathe into my belly. I'm going to exhale slowly. I'm going to breathe into my belly. I'm going to exhale slowly. I tell people, because I'm obsessed with bubbles, because that's in the title of my first book, pretend that you're blowing bubbles, when you got one of those little plastic wands, and then you're just like, and just picture yourself blowing bubbles. And so that can be really helpful. If you can also just feel the chair under your body or feel your feet on the ground, that helps to physically ground you. Or you can even touch your own hand to bring yourself back into a calmer physiological state. So the more we practice doing that, the easier it becomes. And that at least gets us in a state of calm. So that's one of the pieces. That's part of that resilience. Another piece that we need is our intention going into those conversations. When I ask people, like, why is it that you have any interest at all in having a conversation with somebody who has a different political view than you do? There's 4 answers I hear. Some people say, there's someone I disagree with, but I want to maintain a relationship with this person. It's somebody in my life. Some people want to persuade or convince someone. Some want to heal the divide or find common ground. And some people say, I cannot fathom how people can think or act or vote as they do, and I'm trying to gain some insight. Well, it turns out that no matter which of those things you are trying to accomplish, the best way of doing that is by creating a warm and trusting connection where you are trying to understand them. Sometimes we think what we should do is pull out all of our facts and figures and research and all that and lay it all out there, and that's what's going to help. It's not going to get you anywhere for any of those things. But if we are really trying to understand the other person, we've got to come in with a sense of curiosity. And we have to really, really want to know where they're coming from. And I always do. When I talk to somebody and they've got a different view than I do, and I'm like, can't understand how they could think that. Then I'm like, oh, but wait, maybe they can explain it to me. Like it's like if I can't figure out how to work my TV and I've got the owner's manual right there and I don't want to read it. And I'm like, no, 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 no. I really don't get their perspective. Then I'm like, oh, tell me. Tell me more about that. And then asking them to elaborate, even because you really even want to know more. That kind of curiosity is associated with a quality that in my field we call intellectual humility. So,
Mhm.
intellectual humility is when we can say, all right, I have a view. I don't need to change my view to recognize that somebody else might have a view that I'd like to know more about. And you don't have to agree with them. Some people are like, but I don't want to legitimize them. No, it doesn't legitimize them to like be curious. It really does help you to understand. And so if you've got that kind of intellectual humility, you can have strong views, even more extreme views, but still be respectful of somebody else's views and interested in them. If you go in with that kind of attitude, the conversation goes much better. If you're just like, my goal is really to get where they're coming from. So takes us through resilience, intellectual humility, and then, some of those skills that we want to use when we're having those conversations. And I can get a little bit more into that too.
Yeah, and that I think it was in chapter 6 where you talked about the importance of broadening our minds, and that empathy comes into play. It's a huge factor in compassion, things like that. What is the significance of those tendencies? Empathy, compassion, equanimity, courage. Where does that come into play, and how important are they?
Sure. Well, we need to, if we want to reconnect ourselves with other people in our lives, if we want to knit our country back together, we really need to not only broaden our minds, on some level, we need to open our hearts. We need to
Mm.
humanize rather than demonize other people. There's this interesting thing about empathy. So I'm a psychologist, so you would think, okay, I think empathy is the absolute answer to everything, right? But there's a study that they did. It goes like this. In this study, they gave college students a scenario. They're like, okay, imagine that there is a speaker coming to campus who is pretty inflammatory in terms of the way they talk about people in the other party. And the space is really crowded. There's all these people attending, but there's also all these protesters. The protesters are really worked up and they actually managed to shut down the speaker, but not before one of the protesters accidentally whacks one of the attendees in the head with a sign. This is the scenario. I have to say, it's a little like right now, it's like, okay, we can all imagine that scene. So then they said to these students, like, what do you think about this scenario? Like, was it good that the speaker got shut down because they were spouting hate speech? Or was it a violation of free speech that they weren't able to finish their talk? What do you think about that person with the head injury? Are you calling 911 or are you like, well, if they're a follower of that person, then they pretty much deserve what they get? Well, it's not surprising that people's views depended on whether the speaker was affiliated with their own political party or the other political party. So that was one of the things. But that only made a difference if the participant was also generally an empathic person, somebody who generally responded with sympathy to people in distress. As it turns out, that the more empathic we are, actually, the more biased we are, the more skewed our views are. Because if we're empathic and we're more connected with a political party, then we think, oh, I am so empathic. I can see the suffering of people on my side. And I can see the people who are doing harm are those people on the other side, are those like extreme violent people on the other side. So I'm super protective of these people and I'm super mad at them. So if you're more empathic, that's how you feel. It actually gets more polarized. People who aren't as empathic actually were more fair-minded. It didn't matter as much to them what political party they were in terms of how they viewed the situation. So empathy can be an asset, but only if we're applying it to everybody equally.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it just gets us farther and farther apart and more bound to that affective polarization, that mistrust and that distancing. I would say that what we need more than empathy is what I think of as courage. So, courage comes from the French word cœur, meaning heart. And we need to open our hearts in such a way that we're actually more vulnerable, where we're not putting up these shields, but we're instead taking off our armor. And rather than standing behind slogans and statistics, we are putting ourselves out there to say, maybe I don't know everything about this. Maybe you've got a perspective that will help to fill in some gaps for me and at least help me to understand people who disagree with me, even if I don't think it's going to help me to understand more about the issue. We need to allow ourselves to be in human connection with other people where we're trying to understand them rather than trying to dominate them with our perspective. So that's where I feel like courage gives us something a little bit different from empathy when we are in this kind of polarized situation.
The study that you mentioned brought to mind you wrote an article for Psychology Today last Friday, I believe, you know, just a couple of days after the Charlie Kirk assassination. I'm going to post a link to that article in the chat because we are running out of time. But I thought it was very very informative for all of us to understand that. I think you said correct me if I'm wrong, I think you said that tame your media diet, practice empathy, and something about misperceptions. But it was so apropos for what we're being exposed to right now. We are so running out of time. I wish we had another hour, but I want to talk about part 3 with the bridging movement. I'm just going to tell everybody right off the top, I put the link to both of Tania's books in the chat. I highly recommend checking them out because chapter 3, there's a lot to unpack about the bridging movement, what we can do, I think, in terms of effective engagement and being meaningful participants in our communities, and getting involved. I mean, we can't just sit and talk about it. We have to be about it, right? So I want to just ask you really quick, because we are running out of time. I want to find out, what do you hope most people, what do you hope most people will take from your, from especially your last book, but both of your books?
Sure. I want people to feel informed, empowered, and even optimistic. And people are always like, are you kidding? Like, optimistic in this environment? What are you talking about? So what keeps me optimistic is the bridging movement. So this is chapter 10. Like, I end on a high note there. The bridging movement, there are more than 500 organizations that are working on strengthening connections and bridging and strengthening our democracy. So this is a great thing to know about, because it's a good counter to what we see in the news, which is all about the conflict. If you go to the Listen First Project website, you can sign the Listen First pledge. And then every week on Listen First Friday, you're going to get an email that's going to tell you something about one of these bridging organizations and the work that they're doing. And this helps to keep me optimistic. And then if you find that you're like, I'd like to get involved in this, then you can do that also. We can all be part of this movement. It's not naive to think that we can bridge divides. It's based, like the article in Psychology Today, it's like, we are overestimating how much support for violence there is on the other side. I'm a researcher. I'm very evidence-based. And so it's helpful to have that information out there, to helpful to have those resources out there, I think. So what I want people to take away is realistic hope and ways that you can engage, whether it's in personal relationships in your life, even sitting there in your house, but turning down the volume on the polarization, or if you want to get out there and volunteer in your community, be part of the bridging movement. Any of those things are positive steps that each of us can take.
So my one last question is purely out of personal curiosity. Do we have any other books already on the horizon?
Well, it's a really good question. I didn't know I was going to write a second book about political division, but there was such a need for it. So I have to say that a lot of the ideas I get are drawn from when people are asking me questions and there's more of a demand for it. So maybe there's more books about political division. I will also say I write memoir, and I did a podcast called Dr. Waffle and Friends. That's about memoir. I have a podcast called Ready to Be Strong, where I talk a little bit more about how we navigate things. And it's possible that the next book that I write, I also have some creative endeavors that are a little quirky. I write bisexual haiku, which I call baiku. And so maybe there's a collection of baiku coming out next. I have just varied interests. I'm really hoping that we can resolve this political division so that I can focus on some of these other things.
And I did put a link to Dr. Israel's website in the chat. There's so much to look at in there. It's actually was pretty entertaining. It kept me from doom scrolling because I was checking out what was on your website, so it helped a lot. We are out of time, but I want to thank you so much, Dr. Israel, for joining us. This has been enlightening. I highly recommend. We didn't get to even talk about part 3 very much, so I really hope that you guys will take a look at Dr. Israel's book. Hope you'll join us at the Festival of Books next week if you're able. And we are going to, because next week is the festival, that's our weekly sessions will end. Our weekly cafes will go back to our bi-weekly schedule, which will re-up on October 9th. Well, we're going to have David Adler back on the show. He's a constitutional scholar who's joined us. He's kind of on a quarterly basis to kind of keep us in tune tune with what's going on in terms of, current issues and events related to the Constitution. So join us again on October 9th. Please join us at the festival, and please, by all means, check out Dr. Israel's books. You will come back from whatever you read enlightened. Check out the website. That's a good place to start. TED Talks. I mean, there's so much to unpack. So Dr. Israel, thank you again so much. I look forward to seeing you in Spearfish. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and have a wonderful day. Thanks so much. Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.